From the earliest experiences of our peculiar species, we have been under the pressure of certain emotional forces, which are not always easy to understand and still more difficult to control. We recognize emotion in its own principle as that feeling or pressure which arises within ourselves and causes us to exhibit some type of intensity or stress, or causes us to feel or act. Usually, emotion lies at the root of all action, and while action may be regulated by the mind, intellect alone seldom causes us to precipitate activity. We know, for example, that the so-called intellectual, the type that we caricature as being all mind, we also intuitively assume to be deficient in action. We think of what David Starr Jordan used to call the impotent intellectual, the person who spends all his time thinking and does nothing. Unless the mind causes the individual to feel, unless about those matters which he considers some color, some sense of meaning moves to action, then we say that there are no tangible results of mentation. Now, it is extremely rare to find the classic intellectual. We generally merely refer to a person inclined in that direction. For most intellectuals also possess rather strong feelings. The mind does not operate apart from a certain amount of emotional stimulation. But in the intellectual, either this emotion is not strong enough to overwhelm the caution or the analytical attitude of the intellectual, or else the person's interests are sufficiently abstract so that they do not easily transform themselves into action. Many years ago, there was a very excellent professor in one of our universities who was one of the world's authorities on Homer. He had studied the Odyssey and the Iliad. He had studied it in the original Greek. He had written elaborate commentaries on it. And he was really an outstanding man in his field and a very nice human being. But his principal interest was such that there was really no way in which he could become emotionally extroverted on the subject. Therefore, his emotions were very largely admiration and respect and regard and enthusiasm over the Greek original. This would not convey itself particularly to other persons, but it is reported that the only time he was known to become excited over anything was when his students failed to understand Homer. He was not actually lacking in emotion, but we would regard him as deficient in this up-and-go attitude, which we regard today as more or less a proof of normal emotion. On the other hand, we have to question just exactly the importance of emotion in the life of the individual. And in order to do this, we must examine some of the kinds of emotions which persons may experience. It is quite possible for an individual to have good emotional poise and good emotional expression. without any of the violence with which we commonly associate the term. The individual does not have to lose all control of himself or to dash resolutely against inevitables simply in order to prove that he has emotion. Emotions can be very kindly, very gentle, very deep, and yet not especially obvious. The emotional problem of the individual may therefore be solved in two ways. The first, by the reduction of emotional stress, and the second, by expression of emotional purpose. By reduction of stress, we mean particularly that type of emotion which normally has unhappy consequences. If the person allows himself to become the victim of every impulse and instinct in his own nature, he will have a rather unhappy or highly complicated existence. In our Western world today, emotional excess is regarded as normal. We expect people to express not only positive but negative emotions, and as the negative are the most obvious, we are inclined to assume that a person who is not a victim of his own emotions is in some way abnormal. Now this situation goes right down into private life. Of course, it exists on many levels. I think perhaps one of the most prosaic levels was a certain person who came to me and told me that she was quite convinced that her husband didn't care for her anymore. Her reason for coming to this conclusion was that he hadn't beaten her for several weeks. Now, she was really upset over this. She felt that something was gradually fading away in her life that was terribly important. Another person under the same situation would simply have sued for separate maintenance. But to her, her husband's violence of emotion was proof of his devotion. Now, this is a very common experience, although perhaps not on the level of physical thrashing. It is true that we rather expect people who care for us to be a little jealous. We expect them to be a little possessive. We feel that they should reveal their affections by occasional outbursts of emotional intemperance. If they go along quietly and placidly, we may come to the conclusion that they do not need us. And not to be needed is a very serious disaster in the life of most persons. So in order to be happy, we feel that we must express some rather excessive emotional attitude. Now this may, to a measure, be true, but we always face one rather simple fact. Whatever nature does not approve, it cannot be essentially right for us. Nature penalizes all excess. Nature rewards us for moderation and for the dignities of a well-ordered life. No matter how pleasing an emotion may be, it becomes like an intemperance if in its actual consequences it is not beneficial. And we cannot assume from the study of man, from his health, from psychosomatic parallels which arise in diagnosis, we cannot assume that nature wishes the individual to be continually emotionally upset or excessive. Nature wishes the individual to learn the quiet lesson of self-control without inhibition. The moment we have to fight for self-control, we are in the midst of a serious emotional pattern. But if our lives are sufficiently well integrated so that our emotions are comparatively placid, but in themselves deep, mature, and sincere, we come as near as we can to what nature wishes us to express. There is no doubt that under excessive pressure, the individual may find it necessary to break through with some form of over-emotional emphasis or compensation. But it is far better to cure the cause of this than it is merely to assume that if we extrovert assiduously, we will restore our natural balance. The individual in a crisis who resorts to excessive emotion is like a man falling in the water who tries to save himself from drowning by thrashing about with extreme violence. He will almost certainly sink because of the very loss of central coordination. He has lost his security by going into panic, and a great deal of emotional excess is a form of panic in which the individual is striving desperately to save a situation that will only be worse as the result of this stress. Thus, in our Oriental philosophies, for example, there is great emphasis upon the individual becoming a quiet, integrated, well-balanced being. And in the Western world, there are so many hazards to this, so much confusion and stress and strain, that we begin to wonder whether we can integrate our emotions successfully without using some violent escape mechanism. Psychologists in many instances take the ground that the extrovert is a safer person than the introvert. That if the individual does explode periodically, he will not build up any of these deep fixations or complexes which may later cause serious trouble. If he continually permits his emotions to escape by various safety valves, then there will not be enough pressure in the boiler to cause a major explosion. And we do know that an emotional person, continually frustrating himself, holding his emotions continuously under very heavy control, may ultimately lose that control suddenly and violently and commit a major crime or become involved in a very serious delinquency. This is our Western way of thinking it through. And in the West, our attitude has always been not to cure the cause, but to discover some kind of a way of mending the effect. Our nearest treatment of causation appears to be the use of tranquilizers, in which we sort of numb the interior pressures without actually curing anything. The pressure itself rises from deeper sources and causes. And there has to be a measure of planning, of purposeful working with ourselves if we are to achieve any form of stability in modern life. Now, if by experience we discover that we are rather emotional beings, that perhaps our emotions flare up more easily than the emotions of others whom we know, then the problem of planning and a disciplined approach to our subject is very much indicated. The person has to begin by trying to understand the basic principles of our way of life. I don't mean necessarily our contemporary pattern, but our psychobiological way of life, our neuropsychological, by means of which we come to understand what our emotions and our psychic life require in order to function in a normal and proper manner. The first thing that we discover in a great many cases is that our own emotions are not mature. We find that emotionally we are subject to storms which are contrary to our common sense and to the basic intellectualism and thoughtfulness of our natures. We find that emotions are eccentrics to us, that they emerge whether we want them to or not. Once they become dominant, they can be very difficult to work with. If once they come completely out of control, then we find them overwhelming judgment and common sense and leading us into most complicated situations. If we have this basic emotionalism to work with, then we need to realize that it can be educated. Emotions, as we observe them in the lives of different persons, reveal that the emotional pressure does not always operate in the same way. There are emotions of many kinds, and it is important for the thoughtful person to develop those kinds of emotions which are most useful and practical for himself. One thing he has to realize is that he cannot afford destructive emotions. And if he has discovered that he is too often the victim of them, his own security and survival depend upon the correction of the situation. Emotions are most apt to get out of control in a situation that is contrary to our normal instincts and feelings. Thus we find many emotional pressures seem to arise from environment. We observe that we are not in the kind of work that gives us pleasure or gives us a sense of achievement. Therefore we become discontented, and discontent is an emotion. We find the persons that are around us perhaps have certain advantages or certain means which we do not possess. We become envious of what they have. This, in turn, is a destructive emotion. We observe that some individuals have happier, better, balanced personalities than we do, and as the result have more friends and get along better in life. Of such persons we become jealous, and by this jealousy we release another group of emotions. Some of the saddest emotions, of course, are those which result from comparisons, in which observing that our condition is not as favorable according to our thinking as another person's, or that we do not seem to be having the opportunities and privileges and rights that others possess, these turn upon us and begin to develop self-pity, which is again a most negative and destructive emotion. Most of these emotional pressures arise from basic ignorance. They arise from false valuation of situation. They arise from our inability to see the good in the things that we have, or to see the value in the talents or abilities that are uniquely our own. Rushing from ourselves to the contemplation of others and living continuously by comparison, we may develop the negative habit of comparing in a way that causes our own condition always to appear inferior, always to appear unsatisfactory in the light of other persons' conditions. Only an individual who has worked a great deal with people can realize how completely wrong this type of self-pity can be. For experience has proven that the persons who superficially we may regard as most fortunate are often the most miserable, and that those individuals of whom we may be jealous or envious are in their turn secretly jealous or envious of us, because we possess some values, some qualities, some circumstances which they do not enjoy. One of the most common forms of this is this envy of success. The individual who believes that others are more successful, whereas most successful persons have paid a very large price for their achievement in some special field. And against this success, their own emotional tensions are also rising in resentment. In addition to these problems of emotional pressure rising within ourselves, there are other factors that we must also evaluate in some way. What is the basic emotion of man? Anciently, the most basic of all emotions, unquestionably, was fear. Fear being the inevitable result of a little being in a great world. Man was surrounded by things that are unknown, and he is still in this situation. For even though he has explored further into space than most others have gone before him, in spite of the fact that he has enlarged the empire of things attained, man still lives in a continuous pressure of fear. Fear of war, fear of poverty, fear of age, fear of sickness, fear of death. These fears are basic and probably mainspring man's negative emotional patterns. But down through the ages, the human being has tried to develop a balancing force against fear. And this balancing force has come to be called faith. Faith is a series of emotional acceptances. But the average person's ability to use this weapon is rather limited. In the first place, fear seems to arise from realities. Things around us can be argued into being ominous or appearing to be disastrous, whereas faith, for the most part, is our acceptance of things unseen, things that we cannot quickly and easily demonstrate. Consequently, faith requires a great deal more strength of character than the average person has available. Consequently, the battle between faith and fear has been an unequal struggle and remains so even to this time. Our principal faith instrument through the ages has been the gradual development of our religious instincts. Our religion would try to help us to believe that we live in a world in which fear is unnecessary. We believe in the existence of a divine power that is all good. And in the presence of this belief, we seem to find rescue from doubt and uncertainty. Unfortunately, however, man, even while trying to believe, has been much an unbeliever. And by degrees, nearly every religion of the world has been transformed by human practice into something in which fear elements are not only lingering, but are very often dominant. Thus, religions now produce their own kinds of fears. And man has simply substituted fear of certain religious intangibles for fear of certain natural intangibles. Whereas once we were frightened of fires, tornadoes, earthquakes, and the strange dark sounds of the jungle, today we are afraid of ourselves, afraid of each other, afraid of the universe in which we live, and gradually afraid of God. There is a grave doubt as to whether the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. It would seem more likely that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of neurosis. But at the same time, the fear of the Lord has, to a certain degree, contributed to the individual controlling himself. But the person who controls himself by fear is on the horns of another dilemma, because fear itself is a destructive emotion attempting to control other destructive emotions, and the result may ultimately be a general breakdown of control mechanisms. The principal fears that we have on a theological basis involve concepts about which we are essentially uncertain. One of them is the fear of sin, for example. Now, there is a grave question as to just what sin may be. Usually, it is a violation of our spiritual code, a violation of the Ten Commandments, or a violation of the Sermon on the Mount, or whatever other religious code may be our peculiar creed. Actually, however, sin to religious people has become involved in fear of violating orthodoxies. And these orthodoxies may be merely institutional rules set up by men themselves, so that man is not always certain whether he has broken a law of nature or a law of man. Well, it is bad to break man's law in a commonwealth, because the survival of society depends upon keeping certain rules. To break a law of the commonwealth is a crime. To break a law of religion is a sin. And both of these do result in conscience mechanisms, leading again to insecurity, leading to fears, and causing the individual to feel that he is cut off from or separated from the source of his spiritual or social strength. In religion, we are always battered with the problem of superstition, and superstitions die hard. Probably superstitions have caused more collective fears than any other factor in the last 3,000 or 4,000 years. Superstitions are beliefs of one kind or another that seemingly have no foundation in either divine or natural law. Yet by tradition they have come to be powerful. They are beliefs which usually end in fear. Now, in religious work today, we find a good many, shall we say, eccentric beliefs. These eccentric beliefs usually have interesting or glamorous elements which attract our attention. But nearly always, these beliefs, heavily emphasizing supernormal situations or bringing into focus supernatural speculations, while they begin with the tremendous apparent uplift to our consciousness, will end in fear. Generally, these unknown factors begin to turn upon us and cause us a great deal of anxiety. One simple example of that came to my attention long ago and was rather widespread. An individual belonged to a religious movement that believed that the individual, by sitting down and thinking very strenuously, a procedure for which he was ill-conditioned to start with, that by so doing he could strongly influence the lives of other people. So he began to visualize how, by his individual or collective mentation, he might go so far as to restore the happiness of his friends, perhaps reduce the crime wave, overcome the tendencies to juvenile delinquency, and by the power of mind over matter, help to rebuild this universe nearer to his heart's desire. Getting along fine, when all of a sudden he stopped dead in his tracks. It suddenly occurred to him that if he could influence other people might be influencing him, and that he might not even know that this was happening. And the first thing you know, his own right to be himself would be undermined, that he might suddenly find himself the victim of malicious forces, of evil thoughts, of conspiracies. And no sooner had the thought arisen than it was substantiated in his own thinking. He had learned to believe that these things were possible. And from that moment on, everything in life that occurred to him was attributed to someone else, working on him in his sleep, tormenting him in one way or another. He had opened a peculiar door, the door of mental influence. but it turned on him and became a very menacing factor. This door sort of swung both ways, and if it opened to let him into other persons' lives, it opened the other way to let them into his life. This was not nearly as interesting. It's wonderful to be able to influence other people, but tragic to speculate upon the fact that they may be quietly working on you so that you will sell your house for half what it's worth. This was not a pleasant thought, and led to confusion. This confusion, in turn, practically resulted in a chronic nervous breakdown for this person. He was terrified. His emotions became utterly distorted. And in a universe of mysterious wonders which he did not understand, anything was possible. And among the possibilities was that he would ultimately be destroyed by the malicious thinking of those who conspired against him. So religion, in various ways, can cause us new and very deep and real fears. One of the problems that in modern life comes into focus on this point should also be mentioned. In ancient times, religion rested upon the shoulders of the state. Nearly all religions were of community, of city, of nation, or of large collective group. Religion consisted principally of public ceremonies, processionals, rites, feasts, things of this nature. And the religious dramas were presented through the mysteries and other great pageantries. Religion was so definitely a part of the life of the person that he was born into it, he lived in it, and he finally passed out of this life with the proper or appropriate rites of his faith. There was very little religious nonconformity. There was no particular reason for it. Creedalism, as we know, was comparatively rare. An individual traveled little, moved seldom. But if he did move into another community, it was more or less understood that he would then come under the influence of the religious group in that community. For the gods of that community protected the people there. And if he moved and joined among these people, he would then require the protection of their gods. Thus there was not too much stress. But the modern man in religion is in a much more strenuous position. He is not born into his religion normally today. Some are, but many are not. Nor is there a state religion, or one creed about which he may have no reasonable or unreasonable confusion. Today religion is largely a matter of personal choice. The individual growing up finds himself in the presence of a large number of conflicting groups, each group with certainty of its own correctness and with an equal certainty that others, if not completely incorrect, are at least inferior. Thus, the person may drift from one belief to another. There is very little censorship on belief. The very principles of religious freedom require that the person may worship God according to the dictates of his own conscience. Sometimes the dictates of conscience are not very strong or particularly directive, and the person needing religious consolation is likely to become involved in a very highly theological, controversial situation. This again reduces the comfort of his faith, involves it in intellectual criticism and debate, and may result in some serious consequences. One of the most common of these being that the person who, for one reason or another, decides to change his religion seems to come under the anathema of that which he leaves behind. He becomes conscience-stricken or worried or frightful or fearful over the things which he no longer does, that at one time he regarded as necessary and perhaps even took obligations to perform. So religion may, in our way of life, add considerably to religious tension. And those religions most successful in keeping the individual on a reasonable emotional level are those most simple, most natural, and most direct, in which there is a minimum of theology and a minimum of speculation. The moment we become intellectually involved in the controversies of religion, we find a new cause for emotional excess or stress. Is it proper or right for the modern person to be emotionally poised, calm, and quiet? Only if this poise and calmness arises from a natural state of the person. To have this an appearance or an assumed virtue, or for the individual to attempt to impose intense moral restriction upon his own emotion, this is dangerous. But if the person is able to keep his full consciousness, his mental emotional life, in a quiet, orderly way, this has very distinct advantages. But only if it is real, only if it results from a measure of understanding. We do observe from study and research that emotional control that is of a normal and proper kind increases with man's general understanding of life. Thus we observe that a fanatic or an extremist is generally an ignorant person. We have a grave belief, suspicion at least, that if a man like Adolf Hitler had been a well-educated man, traveled extensively, and had been interested in many of the nobler branches of human activity, he would probably never have been a dictator. He might never have made the pages of history, but he would not have left behind him the bloody record with which we are now still struggling. It is almost certain that the more experience we have with living, the better we understand life, the more thoroughly we explore the departments of human endeavor, the less likely we are to fall into emotional excess. Generally speaking, we are most prejudiced about that which we understand least. We are most fearful of that which is unknown, and no individual has been able to live well in a mystery. We are most concerned and most dangerously affected by situations which are strange, new, or different. As our intelligence increases generally, novelty ceases to afflict us. We begin to feel that change is natural. We cannot study history without becoming aware of the constant motion of things. Therefore, we are not going to come into those emotional stress patterns which result from change. Many persons are never able to adjust to the shifting patterns of life. They simply settle down somewhere, and as the world moves on and leaves them behind, they simply suffer. They are not able to be contemporary. A little moderate investigation of history and sociology would help these people. Another group simply cannot reconcile itself to human behavior. They expect much more from others than they can give of themselves. And I know that many most disillusioned persons have themselves disillusioned countless other persons. We simply expect others to have a higher standard of conduct than we demand of ourselves. We demand perfection from imperfect creatures. We expect to be understood, when if we studied for even a few moments, we would realize that such understanding is simply impossible. But not knowing what is possible and what is impossible, what is reasonable and what is unreasonable, what is factual and what is non-factual, we are simply hurt by facts. We are hurt because things move as they must, when we really want them to move as we wish them to. A little anthropology will help a great deal to clear this situation. When we begin to understand the long road that man has traveled, and when we begin to realize that there is still a long way to go, we will not be angry at human beings because they are not perfect, because they still retain the ancient stamp of their atavistic origin. There is no way in which we can demand the impossible, yet we do it every day. And because of this, we bring ourselves into further emotional stress. Then there are other patterns. We expect society as a group to be better than the individuals composing it. We are very angry with our politicians. We are dissatisfied with our laws. And we fret ourselves into early graves over these things. Actually, the world is the sum of the conduct of the persons inhabiting it. We cannot demand more from human nature than may be reasonably expected. To demand more and then to discover the truth is simply to be disillusioned. And many individuals, disillusioned, sulk out their remaining years, refusing to be anything because they have lost their faith in something. In various forms of learning, we find this moderating force. The person who is widely read, widely studied, and widely traveled will not fall easily into prejudices. He will not develop religious and racial intolerances, which can make him terribly sick and worry his associates out of their wits. He will gradually moderate. And the proof lies in the actual experiences easily recorded bearing upon these matters, in which we do know that the integrated person is also the informed person in the majority of instances. We cannot integrate around a vacuum. We cannot build into ourselves a strong position about which we know nothing and about which we have no facts. If, however, we begin to accumulate facts that support a strong position, it becomes natural and acceptable to our own psychological integration. Then we begin to be patient with people. And as hardly a day goes by that we do not get letters, forms, circulars, and various documentations inclined to stir up antagonisms and animosities, racial and religious prejudices, political prejudices, and a great number of persons become influenced by these, simply because they have no solid footings of their own upon which to estimate. They are unable to say quietly to themselves, "This is not true." They are not sufficiently experienced to realize that they are being invited to hold attitudes dangerous to themselves and others. Much of this literature arises from sincerity, but nearly all of it also arises from stupidity. It is lack of discrimination, a lack of understanding, and lack of value. And as it pours in through the mails, it also pours in our ears from those around us. Unhappy, unadjusted persons nearly always share their difficulties with anyone with whom they come in contact. And we may be overly influenced to lose our own sense of proportion and judgment. The busier we are, with various concerns which use up energy, both mental and emotional, the less likely we are to become badly tied up in emotional frustrations and inhibitions and neuroses. Thus, the person who worked from dawn to dark 6 days a week and sat in church 6 hours on Sunday had really very little time to be a neurotic. Also, his general level of thinking made him almost as impervious to fear as to faith. His fears were very elementary. His fears related to rather simple things within his own experience. Perhaps he was afraid of an early frost that would injure his crops, or something of that nature. But his fears were shared by his neighbors. They became apparently perfectly normal anxieties, and usually he could work his way through them. When he got through with a day's work, he was tired. Being tired, he simply went to bed and went to sleep. No electricity to keep him up late, no television to bring with it this monumental improvement of the human mind, which we everywhere notice. Politicians spoke as loudly then as now, but fewer people heard them. And unless you made a long and difficult journey, you hardly knew who was running for any office. These differences have gradually shown a pattern which we may profit by. Today, the individual has a great amount of intellectual and emotional leisure on the one hand, and continual interplay of pressures which cause emotional stress on the other hand. Therefore, his emotions are probably more active in more ways than ever before. But his values are less solid. He has less security in himself, less faith in other people. You see, we mentioned anthropology and sociology, and these subjects, like everything else in knowledge, are also divided into levels or strata. You approach sociology with very little knowledge. After a year or two of superficial thinking, you come to certain notions or attitudes, many of which are essentially wrong and dangerous. Then gradually, over a long period of time, you begin to correct your own errors. It requires a great deal of organized thought to master any art or science. It cannot be done by dabbling. It is as a traveler going to another country. If he stays a week, he knows all about the country because he is moving totally on its surfaces. His first impression seems to be all that he will ever need. If he stays in the country 5 years, he will know nothing about the country. If he lives there for 20 years, he will begin to understand it. So there are different levels of knowing, different levels of appreciation. And in our modern way of life, we have become also rather much dabblers. We do not dig into things sufficiently. Therefore, popular knowledge, as we call it, popular writing, which is essentially a commercial profession, has as its main end not our improvement, but the maintenance of the publishing trade as an economic venture. Thus, we print things that are comparatively meaningless. We print things that are filled with errors simply because they cater to human feelings on subjects. And the haphazard popular knowledge that we seem to accumulate is just about as unrealistic as an historical motion picture, in which nothing practically will be historical except the names. Everything else will be modified for dramatic purposes. There's been talk about doing the Bible in motion pictures and various art media today has become very much a public subject. When they get through with the Bible, it will be unrecognizable. They will mean well, but they will have to improve it here and there. They will have to change it a bit to keep it in focus with public demand. Well, we do the same with everything. So we cannot trust the sources of general knowledge unless we are willing to dig and go deeply enough into the material in order to really get the basic facts well under control. On this superficial method of knowing, we gain very little emotional or mental security. Assuming for a moment that we are sufficiently interested to dig a little deeper, then we know that true knowledge does have a tendency to relax man. Knowledge of many kinds will relax the individual. I knew an individual who fidgeted most of a number of years because of aggravating and mysterious health symptoms. He lived in a state of almost constant terror. Finally, he went to a large clinic and had a thorough investigation and examination and discovered that he was suffering from an incurable malady and that he probably did not have more than a year to live. He immediately sat down, relaxed, and enjoyed life. He could take anything except the unknown. And this is true of most of us. It is not necessary that emotional poise should come always from good news. It comes from facts. It comes from the individual being in control of all that is necessary in order to clarify his own thinking. He is freed from this terrible danger and menace of the unknown. And it is the unknown that does us wrong in a great many cases. So the search for fact and the meditation upon it does help us to integrate, does help us to face things with a good hope, with a sense of security. We are masters of situations where we can handle them factually. But in the measure of the non-fact, we are perturbed. Today, with the leisure that we have, with the smaller families, smaller establishments to maintain, increasing conveniences and commodities, the individual has more time for an internal life than ever before. He has, however, apparently less inclination to cultivate this internal life. The waste of leisure, as Aristotle pointed out, is one of the most dangerous wastes that there are. There is an old saying that came down to us from our ancestors that the devil will always find something for lazy hands to do. And it is also true that negative emotion will nearly always arise where there is not positive emotional activity. The individual simply cannot depend upon quietude or a private life providing him with a normal emotional pattern. If he is not positively engaged, he will be negatively immersed in something. So leisure challenges our emotional life. It makes it necessary for us to plan our own living. And this is part of evolution. This is a very good and proper state of things. The individual who plans his own living has achieved a new dimension of liberty. He has become free of the patterns of the past in which everything was planned for him. Today, happiness is something the individual must find for himself. What he called happiness 1,000 years ago was simple conformity. He did what everyone else did. He worshiped in the same church. He wore the same type of clothes. He engaged in the same level of business. There was very little competition. There was very little reason why he should fear or doubt the circumstances under which he lived, although, of course, even in those days, the adversaries were ever present. But man was accustomed to a busy, rather monotonous regimentation in which he did not dare to dream of many of the experiences which to us are commonplace. Thus, lacking a great deal of stress, as we know it, his stress was of a different kind, and he met it in a sort of consolidated manner. Everyone met it with him. Tragedies and joys were held largely in common. Today, this is all individual. Each person, according to his own place in society and according to his own temperament, has to achieve his own happiness, his own adjustment, his own mental emotional balance. To do this, he must work on it. And one way to work on it is to broaden knowledge, deepen understanding. To do this, he must relax his prejudices. He must relax his intolerances and his intemperances. He must repair and restore those powers of his own faculties which can convey an impression without qualification. Today, when we see something, we interpret it immediately in terms of its meaning to us. We must ultimately interpret it in terms of its meaning to itself. If we can do this, we will get away from the concept that everything is against us or everything is conspiring to our unhappiness. This is not true, even in the most complicated personal relationships. The next point in connection with the possibility of maintaining our emotional balance arises partly from the first consideration. Having leisure, having time, we must begin to recognize the relationship of time to lack of personal purpose. No one can be happy who wastes time, and time wasting is one of our largest pursuits at the moment. In fact, we are not only willing to waste it, we are willing to spend money to waste it. We are willing to make it a profession, and we have created a whole circle of industries that exist only to help us to waste time at so much an hour. The wasting of time is, however, one thing in which we cannot adequately deceive ourselves. In therapy, for example, we often find that it is important to develop some autocorrective pursuit or activity. We say that the individual must get his mind off himself and do something, plant a garden, or build a craft shop, or do something to give himself outlets. But it is not really possible to fool that person. He knows whether his outlet is legitimate or not. He knows whether his craft shop is only another form of aspirin. And it is almost impossible to convince anybody of the importance of a hobby unless this hobby is important to him. We cannot simply set him somewhere to weave baskets out of raffia and expect him to find what we might term valuable therapy. He doesn't believe what he is doing. He knows that he is only still wasting time under counsel. He is keeping his hands busy, but he is still in a wonderful condition to be miserable. Therefore, leisure cannot be used successfully by artificial methods simply to form another way of wasting it. To use leisure, the individual has to recognize that leisure is the key to his own individuality. In a highly regimented civilization such as we possess, in which a large part of our daily activity is uninteresting and has as its primary end merely the maintenance of our personal or collective economy, under such conditions, there is a grave tendency for regimentation. The individual becomes merely a cog in some large pattern of things. He is manufacturing products because of increasing demand. And the increasing demand is the result of advertising. People do not really want these things, but they are psychologized into buying them. To work in this way year after year in order to maintain a family is not satisfactory to man as a being. The reverse situation is also unsatisfactory. Increasing leisure, decreasing family, and this increase of mechanicalization of home life is also giving the woman in the family leisure that she never previously believed that she had. She is afraid of leisure. Perhaps because of her strong emotional polarization, she is better aware of its danger. Being afraid of leisure, we find a number of situations arising. I've talked to a good many women who were registered as housewives, but certainly did not relish the designation. And I have nearly always had them, first of all, tell me that they were worked to death. They have to be. They are so busy, they do not have a moment. The responsibilities of family are simply getting them down. So we go into it a little. What is getting them down? Well, they have a 2-room apartment with maid service. They have 2 children, both away at school. Actually, Grandma could have handled their complete responsibility pattern in about 2 days a month. But these people were so busy, they did not know what they were doing. Absolutely frantic. But it was a very highly defensive type of activity. It was an activity consisting of incessant rounds of insignificant action. Anything rather than to sit down and face self and realize the challenge of important activity. Now, both members of the family have this problem. They have it coming in at them as never before, and as time goes on, it will probably become more acute. As population increases, mechanization increases, we will find the 6-hour day, then the 4-hour day, and perhaps the 2-hour day. And we will have more and more of this thing called leisure. Nature would like it to be that way, because nature would like to have leisure produce giants, but it produces only midgets at the moment. This leisure is the person's opportunity to become the being he was intended to be. Growth was comparatively slow in the days when there were no opportunities for leisure. Today, growth could be very great, but we have still held it within the pattern of a very largely social way of growing, and we have done comparatively little with leisure. I suspect that a good many neuroses arise simply from self-condemnation. We hide this. We wouldn't admit it to our best friend. Therefore, we wouldn't admit it to ourselves, for to most individuals, he is his own best friend. But we know it. We know that something is wrong, that we have a span of life, and that much of this span is neglected. Man having, we will say, 70 or 80 years of life expectancy, spends nearly a third of it in sleep, and of the remaining part, probably 25% in education and age. In between, he has useful years, useful not only economically, but for the establishment of himself as a person. Nature wishes to produce among human beings the individual who is exceptional. It wishes each person to unfold his own potential, not as a nervous wreck, but as a potential ingenious being, a being capable of exploring the unknown, a being capable of exploring the interior part of its own nature toward the establishment of a kind of person. This kind of person reacting into society becomes the basis of progress. And it is not until the individual establishes his own values and establishes them firmly that we can hope to rise above war and crime and delinquency and sickness and very largely overwhelm those factors which result in unnatural or premature death. So the person is either growing inside or he is dissatisfied. And many of his emotional pressures are byproducts of this dissatisfaction. There is great need for psychotherapy that emphasizes that the person to feel better must be better. To feel more secure must know more, and must plan life as an experience of values. Once in a while you will find a person whose vocation and his avocation are the same. He is doing the thing he wants to do. This person has probably the best possibility of happiness of anyone in our world, because he is earning his living doing the things he enjoys. He is therefore not divided, and his libido, his energy, is moving through the things he does. If this case exists, then to each person there is a possibility of at least a part of this. We may not be able to always do the things we enjoy, but leisure gives us the opportunity to set aside a certain amount of time for the enthusiastic expression of our own creativity. And where the individual allows his psychic energy to move into the things he is doing, helps him to get behind his purposes with enthusiasm and vitality and determination, this psychic energy is not piling up a neurotic situation. Our leisure, therefore, should be handled with an enthusiasm that we frequently cannot even apply to our ordinary tasks. We may do our tasks by sense of responsibility or duty, but our leisure gives us an opportunity to put our emotional quotient squarely behind the things we are doing. We can learn because we love to learn. We can grow because we desire to grow. We can improve because it gives us the best kind of feeling to improve. And while these elements are absent, we are certainly going to find that psychotherapy is, to a measure at least, insufficient and inadequate to our needs. Man's great emotional expression is to learn to love, to grow. Learn to rejoice in the unfoldment of the wonders within his own nature, viewing them not as mysteries but as potentials, realizing, religiously speaking, that he is unfolding God through himself when he grows, and he is frustrating deity in himself when he complains. If we can therefore find ways by means of which persons can happily grow, we will have very few serious neurotic situations to contend with. People come to me frequently and they say, well, yes, that's fine. I think that's a splendid idea for somebody, but I'm not interested in anything. There's nothing I want to do. I'm too old. I'm too tired. And most of all, I'm too abused. Nothing means anything. The individual says, yes, I enjoy music, but it's much too much effort to turn it on. Oh, I wouldn't bother going to a concert. You have to find a place to park. One by one, these people wipe out everything and sit down and gather their neurosis around them and just simply stew in it for the rest of their lives. Well, nature says if that's the way you want it, that's the way you shall have it. But you will also have a little present from nature in the form of arteriosclerosis or in the form of premature disintegration of faculties. Why should we have good faculties and never use them? So nature punishes us, but permits us to suffer from our own actions until this suffering finally wakes us up. And if it takes 10,000 years, nature will wait. Nature can afford it better than we can. Consequently, it is more advisable for us to change. Any person living in our modern world who has no interest in anything should really sit down and begin to think about this, because it means probably that they are not sufficiently integrated from the standpoint of knowledge to know what is interesting. They have not had enough area of experience. They have lived always within a small pattern. One common example of the pattern, of course, being the classical parental pattern, in which a family becomes completely immersed in its children until these children grow up and leave, and then the parents are left in a vacuum. They have been so completely immersed that they have prepared no life for themselves, have developed no interest in anything, and have allowed all their emotions to flow toward the children, who suddenly no longer require these emotions. If the parents make a clean break of it at that time, then they are destitute. If they do not make this break and continue to overshadow their children, then the children's condition becomes impossible. So all the way along, from the beginning, leisure means the right of the individual to find the ways to fill his own life. A neurosis is a proof that he didn't do it. If this is the case, there is nothing we can do about the past, but we can certainly begin to think about doing something now. We also have this tendency to feel that everything is too little or too late, that having reached middle life or past without having taken advantage of opportunity, all we can do now is regret and have another negative emotion. All this is quite foolish. Actually, the faculties in man, barring senility or the disintegration of the body, the faculties in man are unaware of age. An individual of 50 does not internally feel any different from a child of 5. except in the sense of a larger experience pattern. Individual does not feel age unless age is accompanied by infirmity. Also, in many instances, even infirmity has very little effect upon the internal life of the individual. We adjust to it without realizing it. And as far as we are concerned, this infirmity has very little effect upon the continuance of our attitudes. It is only when the attitudes go bad that the infirmity begins to move in upon us as a psychological situation. So if a person is 50, 60 years old, and in reasonable health, his attitudes inside himself are no different from what they were at 20. If he has reached this age, broken by circumstances, then he is especially in need of a complete reestimation of his own experiences. Now, psychology attempts to show us all the things that happened and explains in this way why we feel the way we do. But this isn't the end of it, because even when we know we feel miserably, this is not the solution to anything. It's an explanation, but not a solution. The solution lies in recovering from misery and perhaps using the past as a terrible example of what not to do in the future. Actually, the moment the individual loses a dynamic, he should begin to reevaluate his own conduct. This dynamic is essential to him and is natural to him at any age. Time has very little effect on these things, and some of our most important and extraordinary contributions have been given to the world by persons whom we would regard as far beyond the age of activity. There is a whole cycle of time between man's 60th and 80th years, and many of the greatest persons we know would be forgotten had they died at 60. The idea that you have to be young to make it is not true. There are just as many young neurotics today as there are old ones, because of the very circumstances of our time, and also the fact that our educational system is not contributing to the proper emotional outlook on life. Therefore, we are actually, in many instances, being educated into a neurosis, whereas education should, of all things, keep us, as far as possible, open and creative. It does not do this. So to begin the organization of leisure, let us take another point. The average person never begins any activity with the sense of security in it that comes later. The small child learning to play the piano is probably divided between ambition and utter boredom. And if they happen to have one of those classical teachers that makes you play scales for 5 years, the child is likely to regard the experience as an outstanding calamity. Often, however, in later life, the child becomes very grateful for this ability to express creatively through music. But only after a time does the joy begin to really assert itself. Some children are naturally musical and love it from the beginning. But the average person who is not going to be outstanding anyway doesn't have so much emotion in this direction. Actually, however, achievement increases the flow of libido. The more we begin to see the results of what we do, and these results are interesting and important, the more completely we will throw ourselves into a project. So the person who says, I don't feel like doing anything, I just don't know anything that interests me, I'm just sort of tired all the time, this type of individual cannot expect to suddenly and instantly be picked up and carried into an ecstasy of achievement. It just is not going to happen that way. But if this person is tired of being miserable and has reached a point in which doing anything is better than what they are doing, which is usually a colossal nothing, then actual survival demands a rather careful thought and perhaps a bit of heroic effort. Choosing something that is reasonably possible and perhaps somewhat attractive, the individual can then go to work, and with quietude and diligence, and perhaps with a considerable amount of willpower at first, stay at this project for 6 months. At the end of 6 months, either they will know that the project is not for them, or else they will become increasingly intrigued by it, until that which at first seemed to have little interest will suddenly have great interest. And the person will then realize that every subject has great interest if we approach it properly, understand it, and examine it thoroughly. Also today, conversation is becoming a lost art. Communion of interests is failing miserably. And this will continue to do so until leisure makes people interesting. Persons who have interests are seldom bored. People with no interests are bored all the time. Consequently, interesting meeting, conversation, activity results from interest. And instead of merely ventilating neurosis or emotional frustration, our purpose is to use emotion. Use emotion to maintain interest. Use emotion to result in a warm, colorful life. A life in which many things become valuable, important, and meaningful. To the degree that we are able to achieve this, we can break through emotional locking. For the locking of the emotion is nearly always simply due to lack of direction. An emotion with nowhere to go is always either going to lead to dissipation and excess or else to frustration. And if the emotion is frustrated long enough, it will either become violent and lead us into trouble, or else it will sort of die and leave us in a condition of monotonous, colorless existence. Nature does not wish these ends to be the common end of life. It wants the individual to use leisure, as we have it today, or his work, if this is possible, as means of dramatizing his own inner life, of making it constructively important. The energy used to fret and fume and worry and fear is the same energy with which creative genius has enriched the world. The only problem we must use or consider is the use of this energy. If it is used creatively, it makes us happy. It makes us normal. It makes us purposeful. We hold up our heads with a new sense of dignity. We have values that others appreciate. Values that are based on what we are and not on what we have. And we're getting to the point now where the kind of flattery that causes us to have friends only because we supply them free meals, this type of flattery is dying out. Food is too expensive. But where we can really and honestly believe that we have friends because they value us, because we are able to enrich living for them, this is gratifying and pulls us out of many a doldrum. So emotional blockage, which so many persons have, cannot be cured really merely by being extroverted under psychological counseling. Maybe we will dump a load of old frustrations and feel a little better. But we'll go home and start a new load right away. And we'll find that the old ones also have a tenacity about them and will continue to live on even after we think they're dead. Far better than this, really, unless the pressure is so great that help is utterly necessary to preserve sanity. And even then, as soon as the help has produced a temporary relief, we've got to get to work and create emotional living that is valid. Emotion is not just affection, although affection is a very real and valuable part of it. Emotion is creativity. It is activity moved by enthusiasm, by sincerity, by optimism, by conviction of value. In other words, emotion is your living factor, which makes the things you do alive and real in value to you. By keeping this balance, you will probably also find that many little problems fall away. For once emotion gets a good usage, it will not plague you through minor temperamental outbursts. A bad disposition is one in which the emotional life is not directed, and it can be directed by anyone who will use a certain amount of willpower. Now, the individual who will come to you and say they can't do it, it's just simply impossible, will admit to you that they managed to get through college with perhaps mediocre grades, but they made it. The same individual probably or could have done an apprenticeship. The man who just simply has lost all ability to direct his own life still goes to work every day because he has to. Thus it is true that although we may feel that we lack the stamina to make any important emotional decision, we can do it if we really want to. We can do it if the problem is worse than the solution. But we're not sure of that. In our social way of thinking, idleness is regarded as a symbol of success. The individual who doesn't have to do anything belongs to the leisure class. We envy them. We say it must be wonderful to spend the winter in the Bermudas and the summer somewhere else and never do a day's honest work. This is success. The moment you get close to these people, you will find out how wrong you are. Actually, the leisure class is a superior class, only in terms of the fact that it can become a superior class if it uses that leisure wisely. But if it wastes it, then this is the heaviest burden that man must bear. Not only heavy upon himself, but upon his nation and his world. Leisure is only a sign of success if out of it creativity comes. We are never the better for resting. We are always the better for being at it in some way, doing the things we believe to be valuable. But over this activity, we must have the guidance of common sense and vision and understanding, and our leisure must develop around a solid core of facts and real knowing, or else we will simply find a new way of wasting time on the dramatizing of things which are not in themselves of any importance. If, however, you have this problem of not having adequate emotional outlet in life, realize the tremendous drama of creativity, of creating new understanding in your own consciousness, that every time we learn something that we did not know before, there is a tremendous sense of emotional exaltation. We are growing, we are fulfilling, and out of these motions come our greatest emotional satisfaction. And the person who will follow this will find that his psychotic situations will have a tendency to clear up. The person who is busy growing comes the nearest to being happy and healthy of any creature in this world. Time's up. Now, next week we have one question that I think many people are worried over today, and that is what is called population explosion. Namely, the tremendous increase of the Earth's population. Are there getting to be too many of us? Well, I have some ideas on it, but I'm not going to tell you now. You're going to have to show up next week if you want to find out not only my thinking on it, but thinkings of others who have given it some thought. So we hope that you'll all be with us for next Sunday morning. This afternoon at 1:30 in our lecture hall upstairs, the PRS Center Study Group will meet at 1:30 this afternoon for a postmortem on the subject of this morning. And we hope that you'll all be there with your neuroses and any little fixations, complexes, or frustrations that you may have at the moment. Perhaps some very interesting practical ideas can be thrashed out by conversation. Lots of things come out when people really begin to work towards something or think in the direction of something that can be real and valid for them. Also, I'd like to point out that this morning we have on the table our little booklet on the therapeutic value of music, which could be of value in connection with the subject of this morning, and also another booklet, The Value of Prayer and Integration. These can help the individual to find certain constructive emotional outlets for his energies as he finds them in daily life. Let me also point out that the friends have set up for coffee outside this morning. There will be a coffee clutch directly after the meeting of the morning, and we hope that all of you will come out and join the friends, who I think are going to have a pre-postmortem around the coffee pot. So we thank you for coming and hope to see you again either Wednesday or next Sunday. And don't forget to stop and have a cup of coffee with the friends. Thank you very much.